Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Beit Kohenet's Mystics Room, where we offer resources for spiritual journeyers and adventurers. I'm Rabbi Jill Hammer, and I'm here with Rabbi Julia Watts Belser, PhD, author of Loving Our Own Bones, Disability Wisdom, and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole. Julia Watts Belser is professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, as well as core faculty in Georgetown Disability Studies program, and a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Her research centers on gender, sexuality, and disability in rabbinic literature, as well as queer feminist Jewish ethics and theology. And she directs Disability and Climate Change, a public archive project, an initiative that documents the wisdom and insights of disabled activists, artists, and first responders on the front lines of climate crisis. She is the author of Rabbinic Tales of Destruction, Gender, Sex, and Disability in the Ruins of Jerusalem, and Power, Ethics, and Ecology, Rabbinic Responses to Drought and Disaster, in addition to her most recent book, Loving Our Own Bones. And there are also many other wonderful things about Julia that I have had the privilege to get to know a little bit over the time that I have known Julia. So thank you so much for being here for this interview, and thank you for your writing, which is inspiring and deeply informed and thoughtful, and a great uplift to me. Thank you so much for being here.
Jill, thank you so much. It is such a deep pleasure to be in conversation with you and to get to think together both about the book, but about this larger work. I feel such a deep kinship between our work and our ways of moving in the world. And so I love, really looking forward to talking together.
Me too, and thank you for that. I think I'd like to start with something that you said to me around how this book is different. You know, you have done a lot of writing, reclaiming various Jewish texts, questioning and opening and working with, the different aspects of Jewish text and life and practice. And this book, I understand from you, feels different. And I wonder if you might say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So this book is really written at the intersection of my, it braids my scholarly voice together with my personal voice, my rabbinic voice, my thinking and living and breathing as a person who loves wild places and who is deeply spiritually moved by, engaged with, and sometimes enraged by Jewish texts and traditions. And I think that for me, having written a lot of scholarly books, Loving Our Own Bones feels like an embrace of my full self. It is deliberately written for a broad audience, and it's written in a voice that feels truest to the fullness of who I am. So I loved that. It's not a memoir, but it does incorporate some aspects of personal story in a way that, these things often get snipped off the page in my other kinds of writing practice. And it also, I think, when I said yes to the writing of this book, I also said yes to imaginative work, to creative, constructive work that would not just analyze the way that disability is represented in biblical and rabbinic texts, but also think about what that means for me as a disabled person, as somebody who is committed to the building a world where disabled people, and so many of us, right, where all of us can thrive, and as a person who believes in finding spiritual meaning within these texts. That set me a kind of invitation to be much more creative, not just analytical and deconstructive. That's a part of it, but this book has this other element, this making and building and dreaming.
Mm. I love hearing about this, and I love hearing the excitement with which you speak about embarking on this, what you call creative, constructive work. And I wonder if you might say a little bit more. Can you give us an example of, like, how do you approach these texts that you are sometimes, um, desirous of, finding the sacredness in them, and sometimes, as in your words, enraged by them? Like,
Right.
right? How does that, like, how would you define or describe this creative constructive approach that you found yourself taking in this book?
Should I give an example from
An example
the
would be
text?
perfect.
Okay, perfect. Let's take a look at. I'll give a little snippet of Moses, of one of my readings of Moses. Right. So I think in some respects, Moses is the story of Moses. So early on in the book of Exodus, when Moses is called by God to the work, the task of being a prophet, of going to Pharaoh to call for the Israelites' liberation. Moses says no, right? I mean, and he says no because of his own speech disability. It's one of the places where disability is explicitly evoked in the biblical text. It's a place where Moses describes his own tongue as heavy. And of course, what that means, I'm always a little skeptical about efforts to like diagnose biblical figures. So there's a range of options for what that might be. Jewish tradition has often understood it to mean that Moses speaks with a stutter. I tend to just describe Moses as having a speech disability, understanding that that might manifest itself in a variety of different ways for whatever, right? So whatever the particular nature of that, Moses feels deeply uncomfortable with God's call because he feels his own tongue, his own speech is not up to the task. So he says no. And as I imagine listeners will know, God is not swayed by this and says, Moses, go forth anyway. So this is actually a moment, I think, where we get what I think we can understand this as kind of the first reasonable accommodation in the Bible, in the Torah, because God says, all right, fine, take your brother. Okay. And it's a kind of recognition in some respects of the fact that Moses does need a certain support to navigate an ableist world, to navigate a world where people may not understand his speech, or he may not be taken seriously. Sometimes I read Moses here as saying, no, I can't do it, as a moment of internalized ableism. But sometimes I think maybe Moses was a great reader of the room. Maybe he knows that if he goes into the halls of power, that they're not going to listen to him. I feel like both of those possibilities can be true. Yeah? So there's a second thing that happens early on when Moses is being equipped to be a disabled prophet that I think is really interesting and quite liberatory from a disability perspective. And that's that God gives Moses a set of visual signs. This, I think, is even more powerful to me from a disability liberation perspective than the take your brother approach, which is really an accommodation saying, okay, fine, Moses, sometimes you're going to have to be in a place with people who are invested in speech coming out in a certain way. Then you've got Aaron to get through those, to navigate those moments. But this other experience with the signs, I mean, look, this is extraordinary. God says, Moses, you don't need words to convey the truth of this. Use the visual, use your own mode. And that, I think, is an extraordinary decentering of the idea that sort of normative speech and standard words are obviously the currency of real revelation. And so I love that as a moment of disability liberation present within the text. Okay, so far, it's all sounding pretty positive, right? Like it's a great moment where things are going really, I think there's a lot of promise and potential here for disability liberation, kind of liberative readings. But I think one of the hallmarks of my way of reading is to say, is to not be satisfied with a straightforward, positive reading of the text. I don't know what it is about me that makes me uncomfortable with that, but I think it's partly an instinct that even texts that feel good often get turned in ways that cut. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly the case with the Moses story. A lot of the commentator tradition is very uncomfortable with the idea of Moses as a disabled prophet. Mm-hmm. And so part of what I do in the book is to really probe the way that discomfort unfolds. I don't know if I should say more about the discomfort piece, or if you want to ask something else, I'm happy to
say a little more. And I can't help but think of Miriam as you're speaking, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about some of these texts that are more uncomfortable, or the readings are more uncomfortable. But finish saying.
Okay. So I'll give again just one example of a place where in the Moses tradition something really cuts hard for me, and that's this moment. There's a moment in Midrash Tanchuma that asks about Moses, what gives? You back in Exodus, you said you weren't a man of words. Come the book of Deuteronomy, right? By the end of the Torah, you, Moses, are giving this epic speech. The whole book of Deuteronomy is, with very few exceptions, is Moses speaking to the people. So the Midrash says, what do we make of this? And brace yourselves. This is always, for me, I find this just a really gross, terrible moment. It says, the way we understand this is you should learn Torah and then you'll be healed. So for me, that's so poisonous, so hard. Like it enshrines first the idea that healing is the aspiration and let's just say not healing in some like deeply desired sense, but basically like the normalization of Moses, the normalization of disabled people's bodies and minds is the thing that's desired, which hurts, both because it presents disability in such a negative way, and because it's so often not available to so many of us, even if it were desired, right? And because it then kind of makes this break between, it's like Moses, the guy who could be an example of like living deeply into disability experience in a way that is spiritually significant, becomes instead lifted up as this like, oh, you too could have a healing like Moses, if only you double down and really learn Torah. And if you don't experience that transformation that the tradition here, the Midrash seems to think is obviously a desirable thing, it's because you failed somehow to, I don't know, learn enough Torah. I mean, come on. Okay, so I don't like it. But here's where the creative question is, right? Like if I had been writing from a scholarly perspective only, I would have laid out all of the brutalness of that, right? And analyzed how and why that's so problematic. But part of the question that really lives within me is, what do I do with this poison? What do we do with these texts that are so hard to hold and carry? One thing that I have learned from a really guiding principle in my own work is something that I learned from Judith Plaskow, brilliant Jewish feminist thinking about the importance of going deep into painful texts. And one of the things that Judith Plaskow says is that if you just like skip over problematic, difficult, poisonous texts, to like find something nice to drash on. Right? If I had only told you the story about Moses in a kind of liberatory frame and left this junk behind, it leaves the poison to do its work. And so part of my commitment is to actually do the kind of alchemy work of saying, I call out how and why I think this is harmful, and I want to make something different, like create the conditions where something different can arise. So one of the readings I offer in this book of that moment is what happens, what's different between Exodus and Deuteronomy. And I take as bedrock that it's not Moses's tongue. Right? I am committed to the idea that Moses stutters his way through the book of Deuteronomy. What's changed, I think, are twofold. First, Moses has embraced his own true voice. And second, Moses's community has learned to hear him, has learned to honor and recognize the power of his disabled speech.
I find this so powerful that I'm actually having trouble with speech. That's really so that's so powerful as a reading of who Moses has become by Deuteronomy, or how he has embraced who he is. That's
yes. And this twin embrace, right? It's both a shift, I imagine, right? It's both a shift within Moses himself, and it's also a shift within Moses's community. And I think it feels so important to me to say that actually it's rarely the case. Like, they often need to go together and they can be supported by one another. So it feels like it would be cruel to say, oh, Moses and other disabled folks, all we need is a shift toward personal embrace, and then we can move through the world in ways that like allow our no, right? That puts all the burden, right, on Moses. The other deep work that I think happens in the desert is that his community comes to undergo a profound transformation, and that dual work, both the inner work and the outer work, is what I see as really crucial toward the work of supporting liberation as I understand it. If it's only the like private, personal sort of self-help transformation, that's not enough. And it's not just it's not enough, it's actually feels like it can be so it reinscribes the idea that the fault or the flaw was in the minoritized person. And I want to refuse that and really actually help us ask the question, what makes it possible? What can our communities do to help this kind of flourishing happen? Both to support individuals in claiming and knowing the the trueness of themselves, right? The fullness of themselves, that embrace that I call loving our own bones. And then also, what are the material, tangible, structural changes in how we gather, how we are with each other, how we structure time, how we arrange ourselves in space, who we listen to, who we empower, what we expect prophecy and revelation to look like, all of those thousand things. That's communal work. And it is also the other crucial part of this story.
Thank you so much for that. I am noticing how your way of reading that invites both naming what is hard in the text and also naming your own creative relationship with that story, and then what you can find in it allows for the arising of this reading that then you're offering as a, you know, as a way of shaping future community.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I think that I am always thinking as a reader about how text becomes its own kind of call. And I think that really shapes my own thinking about the ethics of interpretation. I'm very committed to not doing apologetics for the text. Like, I don't want to make nice with the text. And I think that sometimes I think that's a really, I think I have a high tolerance for saying no to certain texts, maybe a higher tolerance than a lot of other religiously engaged readers. But I guess part of what I am guided by there is that idea that saying no to certain aspects of a text can actually also be a sacred act, that it doesn't break the relationship. I think that so many of us have been socialized into an assumption that to love a text or to be loyal to a tradition is to assent to it. And I don't believe that. I actually think sometimes the deepest, truest thing I have to offer to Torah and to the, you know, and to the Jewish people, right, is also this capacity to say, actually, no, to name a way in which textual violence is happening, and to refuse to make nice with that. Mm-hmm. I think part of what I do in the book is also commit to lingering with the trouble rather than tying it up with a bow. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm also just as a reader, I think I'm very moved by the Midrash tradition as a whole. So the way that Midrash proliferates meaning. When I think about Midrash, I think about Midrash as a kind of collective enterprise, as an act that also says you can't, part of what it says is you shouldn't read a text only in a single voice. One of the things I love deeply about Jewish traditions of reading is the idea that we are always reading with a whole set of commentators, not just one, right? I love the way that Midrash refuses to resolve itself, right? That it leaves It's like a genre that leaves contradictions in place. And that's something that I try to do in my own writing as well. And I think this actually kind of takes us to Miriam in some ways, right? This idea that actually rather than saying, oh, this is how I read Miriam, this is so with Miriam's story, there's this, in Numbers 12, there's this moment where she says something in about Moses's wife, and we don't know whether it's a racist critique or a word of solidarity and protection, right? Whether she's saying, Moses, why did you marry her, right? Or Moses, how could you be ignoring her, right? Like that is a huge ambiguity. And feminists who've worked with Miriam's story have really worked and leaned into these different possibilities. And one of the things that's really important to me is like keeping all of these possibilities alive and not choosing the reading I like, which is the one that imagines Miriam as, it imagines this moment as a moment of feminist solidarity, and silences the one that presents Miriam in reprehensible ways. Mm-hmm. I actually think that when I grapple more truly with Miriam, it's this idea of Miriam as poised on a precipice that is most compelling and that best names the complexity, like promise and failings of our own lives.
There is in the Miriam story this moment of her return, and I'm thinking about it as I'm thinking about the way that you've spoken about healing. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that moment, which has always sat badly with me. Mm-hmm. This moment of Miriam returns and is sort of readmitted, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about the ways that healing prayer is often deeply embedded in Jewish liturgy. Yeah. Wondering, if there is some wisdom you can offer us around, that piece of Jewish prayer, which and today sometimes people actually borrow, from this prayer that Moses says about Miriam, right? Please God, heal her, right? Which is feels like a moment of othering, yeah. So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So there's this, my thinking about this moment was really catalyzed by a gorgeous poem by Yiska Rosenfeld, The Murmurings of Miriam, which I would just lift up as an extraordinary text. And one of the things that Rosenfeld names there is this idea that when Miriam is marked with the tsarat, the scaly white markings, which the biblical text seems to present as a mark of rebuke or a punishment or an unfortunate thing. Ironically, Moses receives tsarat earlier, and it's a very differently understood sign. It's a positive sign in that context. So I have just noting that I have a little feminist concern about what's going on here in this text to start with. But anyway, in the context of that story in Numbers, the Torah seems to imagine that as a negative condition, as something that needs healing. That's what prompts Aaron and Moses to intervene unsuccessfully on Miriam's behalf. But Rosenfeld's poem, Yiska Rosenfeld reads that as just this extraordinary line where she imagines Miriam saying, "Don't heal me. This is my kiss of God." Yeah. From a disability perspective, I find that extraordinary as a way of thinking about the scar, the mark, the thing that other people perceive as trouble or troubling, as a kind of invitation to intimacy. Now, I want to be really careful and say that, like, the last thing I want to do is tell people how to understand their own disability experience, or to say, like, oh, you should love it, you should embrace, like, no, this stuff is so complicated, so personal, so individual. But what interests me about this moment is the way it runs against the grain of a dominant assumption that disability is obviously negative and should certainly be healed or minimized or reduced or normalized or shrunk down in whatever way possible, right? Like, just erase it. And I think that, so part of the power for me of that reading is that it like opens up a space biblically, spiritually, for thinking, midrashically, for thinking differently. So beautiful. That has been, for me personally, a very powerful way to think with disability as a kind of complex invitation to deeper relationship with my own embodied self and with the divine. But the thing about Miriam returning, this has been a really potent moment for me for thinking about, like, once Miriam does her 7 days, it's like the story imagines that she just comes back and it's all over. It's such fantasy about how, like, oh, that was then, is it the past? There was a cure, it happened, you're reintegrated, it hasn't left a mark. Right. So I think about how, right, even when we have a situation, for example, where folks do experience kind of like a significant illness, injury, disability experience, and there is kind of return, restoration, whether you want to call that cure or healing or repair or whatever. So often the cultural narrative is like, oh, that was done, slam the door on it, right? And just return quickly. And I think that also does a deep disservice to the way that experience with disability, with long-term significant illness or injury, shapes us. And so when I think about Miriam returning, I think about wanting to acknowledge how profoundly she has been shaped by her time in the desert. There's a moment in the book where I talk about, like, imagining her as, like, scoured out by that experience, not because it was a punishment, right? But because there's something about being thrust outside the regular rhythms of life and community.
So please go ahead.
One of the things that disability really invites me to ask is, given that these realities are a part of our world, is there something we can make of them? And is there a way that, like, we shouldn't have to experience them? But when we do, is there something we can make of them that also makes their fruits sacred and holy?
I'm really sitting with this piece of wisdom. The making of this experience is holy. there's a moment in the book where you talk about someone who wants to pray for you in a mattress, in a mattress store,
Yeah.
and it brought me back to a moment where I was about to give a lecture, and someone who was there to sort of tidy the hall, came over to me and wanted to pray over me because I don't see out of one of my eyes, and that the thing that came out of that experience for me was my sort of stopping someone else to kind of process what had just happened and saying, I don't want this to be healed. Like the piece of it that was most salient to me was not exactly that I was offended by his behavior, although I might have been, but that I had entered into this narrative of, oh, perhaps I could be healed. And then I had to think about what I thought about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And about the question of of what that disability has created in me, or
Yeah.
I have grown with it. And you're naming this in such a beautiful and powerful way.
Thank you so much. And thank you for naming that story and how it unfolds in your own life. I think one of the things that feels like a touchstone for me around healing is wanting to create more space for folks to hold agency over if and when and how we get drawn into healing spaces. I find that there is often a kind of broad cultural presumption, especially in religious spaces, that healing is always good, that it is always wanted, and that we all know what we mean when we talk about it, okay? When we pray for it. And I reject all of those terms, right? So I think that there are times in my own life when I have absolutely yearned for and hoped for healing for certain things in certain ways. Okay? But I don't assume that healing is always welcome or wanted. It certainly hasn't been for me. I often feel other people's well-intentioned desires to pray for me or to have me experience healing to be a kind of deep imposition. And then I think there's another element that I would name, right? So on the one hand, I said wanting to create more space around agency so that the person who the person whose healing is at question is the one who's centered here in terms of what's happening. But the other piece I would name is, so in a nutshell, that means don't pray for other people's healing without checking in with them first. And really careful how you check in with them, because it can be so easily coercive, or as you said, sort of draw this into a narrative. Even the ask can be hurtful. Though of course it's almost never meant that way. This is just that business about checking the assumption that it's obviously benevolent, obviously a good thing. Oh, just have to be careful. It's so fraught. Okay? But the other fraught thing is there's a disconnect sometimes between what we want and what we receive, right? So let's take a scenario where somebody truly does indeed desire healing, right? So the other reality is it doesn't always happen for us. And that's the other thing that I feel deserves more attention and recognition, that this business about healing, so often people have asked me the question, because I'm a wheelchair user, people always ask me, oh, do you want to be healed? And this other question of like what to do with the costs of not experiencing healing. In my case, I'm sort of like, yeah, skip me on the whole healing business. But like that disconnect is also really, really painful. And I think about this a lot in the ways that something I've really learned from communities of folks who are living with chronic illness, how often there is this profound pressure to get better. Okay? And when I experienced this myself when I first I've always had a disability, but there was a period in my life when I became a wheelchair user where I was suddenly like experiencing a whole lot of medical attention, and I wasn't getting better, right? Like it was failing to heal properly. And so I think we need to also attend to the way in which this language about healing can end up really stigmatizing and landing very hard against folks who don't fulfill that trajectory of getting to healing. Right? There are a couple ways we can work with that. One is to say healing might look different to different people. I think for folks who are deeply attached to the idea of healing, that can be a really helpful way to reframe. Like healing doesn't mean erasure of disability. Healing might be that kind of move we were talking about earlier with Moses, right? That kind of embrace of experience. Yeah. I myself am just kind of allergic to healing. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I would just rather not. I find it difficult. I'd rather than reinterpreting healing for myself, I just often would rather not engage with healing and healing discourse because of the way that it feels like it lands so hard against my own body, mind, and soul. I don't want to be, it feels like something people are trying to do to me. I don't want that.
Yeah. I hear that. It feels so important to receive that as a culture.
Yeah.
So we're getting, as we begin to wind to our conclusion, I would really love for you to say something about God on Wheels. I was so excited by the way that you talk about, how through a disability lens, God could be different. I was just very sort of, my imagination was caught by that. So I wonder if you would say something about it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I love this, for me, this image of God on wheels was such a moment of disability revelation, a kind of extraordinary sense that like drawn from the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, where the prophet sees the divine chariot. I mean, I think one of the things I love about this moment is actually the story of how it like bursts onto the scene in my own consciousness, right? It was like night and day, many iterations of hearing this text before one Shavuot morning, it landed for me and I was like, oh, wait, God has wheels. Right. And I guess I'd love to ask you actually, Jill, to think with me a little bit, because there's so much I could say about it. Like, is there something you particularly want to talk about or that you're particularly excited about with it? Like what grabs you? I think I'm really curious about that, because it is such a powerful moment for me. And I'm also really thinking about how to draw it out beyond just the fact of kinship, right? Beyond just the mirror, that gorgeous, delicious, subversive moment of seeing myself in God's image.
I love the question. I mean, there are a couple of things that occur to me, and one of them is related to what you just said, right? Which is often when we're talking about theological liberation, right, there's something about finding God in yourself and yourself in God, right?
Yeah.
That God does not look like other people, or does not,
Yeah.
is not
Yeah.
like other people,
Yeah.
but could be like you.
Yeah.
And that feels like a really just sort of a human need, and and a real thing. But another piece of it that really strikes me is about God's vulnerability and God's being shaped by that.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a way that the philosophers, as I think you note in the book, often perceive God as invulnerable, right? God is
Right.
perfect. God is right. There's right. Nothing could ever go wrong with God, right? And how alienating that can be to us beings who are not like that, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
your vision, gives us a different God.
Right. Right. I mean, I think one of the things that really got me excited about this theological image is the idea that if God is on wheels, maybe God has an access problem, right? That for me, the image of God on wheels at first is grounded in disability joy, right? In this, like, the way that in my own life, in my own story, coming into my experience as a wheelchair user was actually an expanding of it was freedom, right? When I finally got wheels, I felt my horizons open in a way, and the embodied feeling of like moving through the world on wheels is, it's delicious for me at its best, but it's not always at its best, right? At its worst, it is frustrating and painful and lonely and alienating, and it is also about being shut out of spaces that I want access to. So it's been really provocative, I think, for me to imagine God as facing access barriers. I guess I should say, just like to make clear, when I think about being shut out of spaces, I don't think like, oh, how sad that I'm a wheelchair user. I think, oh, how crappy that, the city didn't prioritize elevators in the subway system, or all of these buildings have 4 and 5 steps to get into them, right? I mean, that's that shift from, oh, how sad about my own embodied experience, to, oh, how shitty that the world has not been built for me. That's actually a really important move. Okay? So holding that in mind, then I think, what are the ways that we shut God out? What's the equivalent of in our own inner lives and inner architecture? What are where are the places where we didn't bother to build a ramp? We didn't think about the elevator. We slammed the door. And of course, I'm using wheelchair here because it's my own lived experience. It's also so important to say disability access is so much deeper and wider and broader than just wheelchairs and ramps. There's so many different dimensions to what access looks like. So I want to really say, like, we should use all of the metaphors. And when we're thinking pragmatically about access, really make sure to think very broadly and deeply about what access looks like and feels like. But that question, how do we shift our own inner space so that we're not putting up barriers to the divine? That feels to me like a really crucial, mystical, spiritual question that I've come to in part through thinking about God's access problems. So often we think about like, oh, I want to get to God, right? I want to get close. What if it's flip it though? What if the problem is like God is wanting closeness with us? And it's my tendency to schedule things back to back and leave myself no time to breathe, for example, that is shutting God out of my own space.
That's a wonderful thought to leave our viewers with, and a provocative practice, I think, for all of us. I really want to thank you, Julia. This has been a time chock full of wisdom, and I highly recommend your amazing book. With its deep thought and deep feeling, about this and about about us as beings in bodies. I'm just grateful to you for your profound and transformative work.
Thank you so much, Jill. This has been a really beautiful conversation, and I really, really appreciate getting to talk with you and think with you about all of these questions.
And thank you to everybody who's listening. And take care.